Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this final session. I'm conscious of the fact that it's been a long day and an extremely enjoyable day, but nonetheless, I'm sure everyone's probably intellectually exhausted at this point. So I'm going to depart somewhat from my prepared remarks in the interest of being a little bit provocative and trying to pull together some of the very interesting ideas and comments that we've heard in the course of the day. The narrow focus of this panel discussion is audit quality and standards implementation, but perhaps I could try and put that in the broader context and just sort of ask, well, why are we all here? It's not just about standards implementation, it's not just about audit quality, it's ultimately about providing high-quality, decision-friendly information for investors. I mean, that's the end game, because all the rest of it has no meaning or purpose, just viewed in isolation. So if we look at what is required for high-quality, investor-friendly information, there is, what's generally called the financial reporting supply chain, which starts with the reporting entity. And let's not forget that the ultimate responsibility is the reporting entity. They're the people who produce the information, and they're the ones who have a responsibility to their investors to provide accurate, meaningful, and relevant information. And in that, there are issues there about corporate governance, about audit committees, the role of audit committees, the qualifications of audit committee members, what they say to their annual general meetings, how they report. So that's clearly a very important indicator. And of course, also the preparer. The preparer, there's not much attention paid to what is the qualification requirement for a preparer. I mean, do they need to have, by law or best practice or code, some sort of qualification that befits, the ultimate responsibility of preparing complex financial statements? You then move on to international financial reporting standards, and Hans had to leave, but I've made this point to him before. But our IFRS is still fit for purpose. The notion of one single measure of profit might have served us well 500 years ago, but in today's world of complex business, multiple business lines, hundreds of thousands of employees across hundreds of geographies, this quest for a single measure of performance, which then has to be supported by, in some cases, 400 or 500 pages of explanatory notes, is that really providing investors with transparent, usable information? We then move on to audit, which audit standards and audit, and we'll come back to that, which is the purpose of this panel. But then we move on to the regulators, and I think we had a very interesting discussion that just ended on the role of the regulators. The regulators, I believe, do have an important role to play in assuring the public interest is met. And frankly, if others have to step up to the plate and do what's needed to ensure that the public interest is served, then I would humbly submit that regulators need to as well. And I appreciate that resources are scarce. The number of people might need to multiply, but that's really for the regulators to send that message to their legislators and to their ministers of finance or whoever holds the purse strings. I think there's also very important issues on the boundaries of regulatory supervision and what the auditor is required to provide. At the end of the day, the audit opinion is an opinion at a point in time, which probably loses its relevance and currency, 2 weeks after the event. The regulators, on the other hand, do get periodic reports from listed entities. They have to submit quarterly filings. In some jurisdictions, they require a management discussion and analysis, which should set out management's view of key risks and areas. So even if the regulators cannot look in detail at every entity, they can certainly look at systemic risk that might be building up. They can look at sectoral risk. And in certain cases, for the most significant public interest entities, they can also look at entity risk. So, the debate is what more should the auditors have to report on, but one could also turn that around to say where the regulators feel more is needed based on their risk assessment, maybe those should be specially requested rather than just provided as a matter of course and contribute to the information overload that everyone talks about. The next link in the chain is the rating agencies, and I think Stephen touched on that. Only recently brought into under some sort of regulatory regime, but even that on a sporadic basis. There's no global sort of oversight of those rating agencies. In many ways, for the individual investor, I mean, I would rather say, what's the rating assigned by Standard & Poor's, rather than let me have a look at the financial statements and pour through 500 pages to see if I'm making an informed decision. So the rating agents really carry a proxy, a very important proxy, which the investor community relies on. But again, not much being done there, certainly not on a global level. And then we talk about the investor community themselves, the investment analysts. It's all very well to say that we need good information, but I think they also have a responsibility to say when they think they're not getting it, and to contribute to the discussion on what they want and what they need to be able to prepare reliable analyses and assessments of the entities that they're evaluating. So if you look across that financial reporting supply chain, I think, maybe as an accountant, but I'm justifiably proud, I think, of the fact that the audit community is probably far more advanced than any other of those links in the financial reporting supply chain in terms of having global standards, in terms of having those global standards under public interest oversight, in terms of having the major network firms using those standards in developing their audit methodologies. And I think there really needs to be a discussion ongoing as to, we look at the vertical cuts, the silos, what's happening on corporate governance, what's happening on, rating agencies, what's happening on regulation. We don't look horizontally in terms of the linkages and how they interrelate. So, I think if we are genuinely trying to avoid the next crisis, if we are genuinely forward-looking, I think we also need to look very carefully at what some of the weaknesses are in the global context in terms of the work of some of those other links. So if I now turn to what we're here to talk about, which is audit quality and standards implementation, we have, in common with all the other panels, a very distinguished panel here today. Moving from down the table, Robert Hodgkinson is the technical director of the ICAEW, the Institute of Chartered Accountants of England and Wales, and just declaring my interests, which is also the institute that I'm a member of. And in addition to technical matters, he's also responsible for its thought leadership and research programs. And again, having declared my conflict of interest, I have to say that the ICAEW is probably cutting edge in looking at what some of the issues confronting auditors and accountants is today, and what some of the issues that they need to think about and reflect upon in the coming years. So, Robert, welcome, and we look forward to hearing from you. Janine van Diggelen is, she's the head of Audit and Reporting Quality Division of the Netherlands Authority for the Financial Markets. And she's also the chair of IFIAR, which a number of speakers today have commented on its importance and on its rapid growth. And preceding her assuming the chair, she was the vice chair for 2 years. So, in a short history with 4 years involvement, Janine, I think, for better or worse, can claim a lot of credit or responsibility for IFIAR's progress. And finally, last but not least, we have His Excellency Riyad Al Mubarak, who's the chair of the Abu Dhabi Accountability Authority, who has really been a powerful voice in the Middle East for issues of accountability. And beyond his mandate, his day job, as I would call it, he's also taken a keen interest in the profession and how that part of the world and emerging economies generally fit in to the broader global regulatory framework. So in consultation and with the agreement of the panelists, then they don't have set speeches as such, but I will just try and ask them some questions to which they'll respond, and hopefully that'll make it more conversational. And again, last session of the day, feel as liberated, as provocative as you want. Let's try and keep these people here and hanging on our every word until it's time for drinks. So Robert, what do you see as the value of an audit? Because I think one of the speakers earlier on today mentioned that audit is perhaps becoming a commodity. I have expressed the view that a point in time reflection on the financial position of a company is probably not what's needed on an ongoing basis for investors or regulators. The good old audit opinions that I was involved in preparing when I was an auditor, had a much more limited scope of other financial statements, free of material misstatement and fairly presented. But there seems, as we've heard today, an expectation of a lot more from audit committees, investors, regulators, audit oversight people of what an audit should do. So, what's your view? Does it have value? Is it out of date? How can it be improved? Where do you see it in 20 years' time?
Thank you, Faiz, and I should say that I'm glad you came back to those questions because just in case this looks slightly disorganised, don't worry, there was a comprehensive conference call of all this panel before a week or two ago where we sort of roughly said what we're going to talk about, and I didn't recognise much of what Faiz said by way of introduction. But then he kind of...
know me know that standard operating procedure.
But then he did alight on three questions which he asked me to address. What is the value of audit? How will it change? And is point in time audit still fit for purpose? And just to confuse you, I've got four answers to those three questions, and I'm not quite sure how they match up. And also, since I won't point out who it was in the audience that says you're going to have to say something pretty outrageous to keep me awake, but don't worry, Jalil, I won't mention it to anyone else. You might think that I've already had the cocktail drink as I pursue what will be an analogy, but bear in mind it's just an analogy. It's not actually true, and you can only go so far. And in answering this question, what's the value of an audit, I started off, and I thought I must be able to quote some sort of complex economic theory here to say there's something quite odd about an audit in that you can't kind of consume it, enjoy it, value it in isolation. I mean, you've got to audit something. Nobody ever said, that's a really good audit. I don't know what you audited. I'm not interested in what you audited, but it was just wonderful to see the report or to observe the auditors. So I was thinking, well, how do we bring that alive? Because I could have used some economics argument for that. But I just thought, actually, it's kind of a bit like a roof. I can sense a real sense of foreboding and anticipation here, because I didn't have time to work out another analogy to keep anyone here awake. So actually, roofs are good and bad, but I mean, actually, you can't use a roof in isolation. It's got to be on a building. And you've got to audit something. There isn't just a roof in isolation. Carol doesn't look convinced, but I think it depends upon something else. And actually, unless it's attached to something, and it's attached to something that itself is pretty solid and well built, it's not going to work. But you've got very clear expectations of when it fails, and you're very disappointed when it fails. I should say that this roof analogy comes out of, first of all, that our Finance Minister in the UK, the Chancellor of Exchequer, keeps going on his principal analogy for what the government is doing now. It's saying that they are fixing the roof while the sun is shining, but more personally, I did have a leaking roof 2 weeks ago, and it's not funny. And I felt all the kind of feelings towards the guy who supposedly fixed this a few months ago that I would have an auditor who told me that it wasn't really his fault that the financial crisis happened. I would say that I expect that there will be detailed standards around how you actually do roofing. I expect somebody knows what they're doing. But actually, there are some interesting points here that it fundamentally depends upon knowing about the building. You can't just build a roof on anything, and often roofs will fail because the underlying structure isn't there. And there's no point putting a roof on a pretty crappy building because it will end up being the roof that looks like it's fallen in, but it can be something else that's wrong in the structure. So I'm just about clinging onto the analogy here. I'll go on to my second point about this. What I'm saying is that roofs are undoubtedly of huge value, but actually you don't kind of enjoy them in isolation, unless there's anybody strange here who lives in a roof which is on nothing. The second point I want to say is that actually if you've got a roof, make the most of it. And what I'd like to say here is that you don't just have to have a utilitarian roof that works and is built in accordance with the building standards for roofs. And I'd make a desperate leap here to some of the things that I've been seeing and what the Institute's been doing, but also the sort of things that Stephen was talking about in relation to the extended audit report. If somebody's come in and done something and built a roof, actually get the maximum value out of it. They'll be able to tell you a lot about it. Just to put this in the context of my recent experience of a leak, I did want the final time, and it works now, for the roofer to explain to me precisely what he'd done, how he'd addressed the risks which had gone wrong previously, and he enjoyed doing it, I can tell you. And actually, that's what we're doing with extended audit reports. If you paid for the thing, get the auditor to tell you what they've actually done, what they thought were the biggest risks, so you feel that you're getting extra confidence. He's not just saying, right, I'm off, I think you'll find it'll be okay. The other interesting thing that we've been trying to do is get the insights of auditors from actually doing a lot of audits. What are the things that you come across which are insights you've got as auditors which you could share with other people? And it doesn't have to be what gets reported, even in the extended audit report. This is an idea which was born in the Netherlands, but we've picked it up and carried on by talking about, here are auditor insights out of doing audits which we think are of wider benefit and will be of interest to people. So we've done this in banking, in relation to cyber security, retail. If people have paid for an audit, make sure you get the most out of it. Share your experience. Inspire confidence that actually you've done a good job. The third thing I want to say is that you don't need to innovate to meet new roofing needs. And see areas where actually you could really be useful. And I know a lot of you are thinking, of course, there's no innovation in roofing. Just you might say there's no real innovation in audit. I would point out, as someone who watches Wimbledon, it didn't used to have a roof. Once upon a time, people used to spot that business in retail turned down horribly if the weather was bad. And you would have said, that's just what business does. And people started building the most phenomenal shopping malls with huge spans and vast amounts of entertainment underneath them. You couldn't have built that in medieval England, but it took a long time for people to work out that you could actually do things differently. Now, to get my analogy with what we're doing as a profession, we've kind of spotted that a lot of the focus of the post-financial crisis regulatory reforms was to improve bank capital. And there's a lot more bank capital being raised, and the details of what needs to be raised is in lots of submissions to regulators. It's been disclosed in financial statements. There's explanations of risk-weighted assets and bank capital ratios and so on. But there's a question which, and we went to engage with the Prudential Regulatory Authority in the UK, who said, actually, there's a lot of disappointment about bank audits, but we think it's really because they'd like to stretch the audit. People like to stretch the audit. So it actually deals with this new vital information. So why don't we ask you, as ICAW, to come up with initially a consultation on what it would look like to start auditing bank capital numbers, recognising they're different from auditing the financial statements, and don't try and just turn the financial statement audit into something else. Other examples are after the LIBOR rigging and other rigging scandals, and this was actually having gone to see the CFTC in the States, who are the people who first levied a very horrible fine on Barclays, went to say, well, what sort of assurance could be provided which would show that submissions met certain criteria and were being aggregated by the compilers of benchmarks in reliable ways? So just go and apply your core audit methodology to new questions where actually there's real vulnerabilities and risks. And the scale of activity that's potentially opened up for auditors meeting expectation gap issues is quite substantial. And it's in a way quite sad that maybe auditors need a bit of encouragement to do this because they're so used to just waiting to see what new requirements for audit will be. My fourth point is, and it comes back to Fires' third question, I think, about, he said, is point in time auditing kind of past its sell-by date or something like that. I actually want to make a sort of contentious observation here that audits like roofs meet continuing needs. People will assume they can rely on it whenever they last had it fixed. Actually, I've reversed the question because we often, from our technical auditing standard setting point of view, say, well, actually, it's only valid at a point in time. But for real people out there in the world, as illustrated by the financial crisis, they don't say, well, the audit issued that audit opinion 2 months ago, so of course it would be unfair to express any disappointment. They actually say, well, the next time one of these is happening is in a year's time, at least, so I assume it will see me through till then. So maybe we need to think radically about actually audits are there, just like roofs, they're there to meet continuing needs, not point-in-time needs. And a lot of these, if I now bring my third and fourth point together, a lot of the new challenges facing auditors are things which are by their nature unpredictable, continuing threats which are there all the time. And we really need to rethink the model. So cybersecurity doesn't respect any point in time. Those risks are there all the time. So what sort of continuous assurance do you have? And the dangers of big data, where information's going out there all the time, by companies associated with companies where auditors, by a kind of halo effect, have their reputations on the line with that information, that demands a very different response. But actually, it's what's been there all the time, that we've always had this assumption that an audit lasts until the next one. So there are my four kind of ways of thinking about the value of audit and how it will change and how we need to think about this issue of point in time versus continuous. So if you go away with some messages there, understand that an audit is like a roof. Make the most of your roof. Innovate to meet unmet roofing needs. And remember that roofs themselves meet continuing needs. They're not expected to leak or fall down a few days or months after they were installed. And maybe that would give us an approach to innovation in which standard setters have a vital role to play. I will say that we often focus on the IAASB's work with its financial statement auditing standards. But the most useful thing that we as ICAW use in developing new services is ISA 3000 and the assurance framework, because that gives you a basic toolkit to develop new assurance services, whether it's on benchmarks and indices or bank regulatory capital numbers. There's a brilliant standard there which sets out how you design an assurance service, and what we need is a profession that knows how to use that standard to meet new needs, as well as observing the far more detailed standards around financial statement audit, which reflect the fact that's a much more established product with a lot higher regulatory expectations associated with it. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Robert. I won't try to extend your analogy, so let me just ask the question directly. But this notion of continuous audit, or you know, the fact that maybe there are certain things that need to be looked at continuously, and so who are the parties to that discussion? Is it the auditor and the entity? Is it the auditor, the entity, and the regulator? Is it the regulator and the auditor? How do you see that conversation developing over the next?
And of course I have to admit that this is kind of vaguely sketched out rather than all coloured in, but I think you can say any of those parties. And I would say that we tend to focus a lot on the audit as a service and a product, whereas, and here I draw on a history of the Institute, I mean, actually being an auditor was being an officer of the company who had certain responsibilities. And just like directors, they don't kind of have this periodic involvement about, well, it just depends when there's a year end or a quarter end or a board meeting. Actually, you have a relationship with that entity and need to think about interaction with stakeholders, just as there's interaction that's expected of directors, non-executive directors, the chairman under any corporate governance framework. So maybe we need to think about actually thinking through where your responsibilities are and what services, support you think you should be providing to discharge your obligations as an officer of that company. And if I sort of, it sounds like I'm being, completely unreasonable there. The reality is that when any business has a major problem, even if it's nothing to do with what might have been within the scope of audit, anyone who's involved in our business says, I better look at who the auditors are. I wonder what fire they're going to come up with. There's no kind of question of was that within scope. This was brought home to me when a taxi driver who was taken me to the institute on the day the libel fine broke said, because I said, of course, we went to the Institute of Chartered Accountants. He said, I bet PwC have got a problem. And he wasn't kind of saying, I wonder if that was in the scope of the audit. It's clearly validating inputs to the libel benchmark. It was nothing to do with anything within the scope of audit. It was just say, what are they going to have to do?
Just one other follow-up. I mean, you mentioned the historical tradition of the auditor being an officer of the company, linking that to the point that David Wright had made in the earlier session about the auditor perhaps being an observer on the board. Now, I realize you don't speak for ICAEW, and it's probably an unfair question to spring on you, but purely as a personal observation with a lot of witnesses that it is a personal observation, what are your views on that?
I can see how you'd say there's a logical kind of follow-on, which means that, of course, you could expect to be there. But I think quite sort of intelligently, you could think that, where is this appropriate? So, we recognise that people might have rights of access to anything, anywhere, as an auditor, just as, a non-executive director can go anywhere. And there might be certain, a forum like a board meeting is clearly for members of the board. There's not that's what it's there for, and bringing in that other party might actually disrupt the dynamic. So I think it in very practical terms, but also think that, there should be a right of attendance, which I think would be pretty well undisputed, that you'd be very worried if an auditor said, I do want to come along and hear that discussion or take part in it. Then it would look odd if you said, well, you can't do that. But I don't think there's a kind of assumption that you'd be there all the time, just as it would be very odd if non-executive directors kind of, popped around like the Spanish Inquisition and turned up, to surprise everyone at any point, because it would change behaviour all around the company if people thought, and it might be quite dysfunctional if people thought, at any time the auditors could pop up. So I think there's a kind of pragmatic way of viewing it, but I don't have any objection to saying that they do need to, be able to bear witness at a board meeting rather than when it's just something narrowly to do within their scope.
Okay, well, thank you. Moving away from the crystal ball to the hard realities of today, Janine, you've kind of now been involved with IFIA for 4 years, and you've done your role in the Netherlands for longer. What does good audit quality look like, and how far are we from it? And what is IFIA doing to make it better, and what maybe isn't on the agenda now, but again, thinking more discursively, what do the audit firms need to do to make it better?
Okay, thank you, Fayez, for your introduction and interesting questions. First, I'd like to congratulate the PIOB with its 10th anniversary, and a big encouragement from my side to keep up with the good work and to oversee the standards, whether they keep on meeting capital market needs and public interests. Yes, I'd like to address the questions from Fayez by starting to talk about what is actually audit quality And then actually, what is the current state of play of audit quality globally? And then I like to also say something about the important role international standards can play to drive consistency in quality. And I'd like to end with the question on what IFIAR is doing towards the firms and itself as to improve audit quality globally. So let me start by saying, it's an open door maybe, but it's really very important to emphasize audits play a very important role in the functioning of and confidence in the capital markets. Investors and other users of the financial statements expect high quality audits. But there are different views on and definitions of audit quality or high quality audits, depending on who you ask. If I would ask an investor, maybe the investor would say, well, I want no unpleasant surprises. If there's an audit opinion, I don't want the surprise of a fraud coming out in the open or an unexpected sudden bankruptcy. If I would ask an audit committee member, this member could have additional or other things in mind. Maybe that the auditor and the high quality audit could only be there when the auditor has very in-depth industry expertise, or maybe things like boardroom presence in view of personal competencies of the auditor, but maybe also quality control within the audit firm that plays a role. So many different answers to maybe this very simple question. We talk about audit quality a lot and high quality audits, but what is it actually? Regulators and others have started many projects on audit quality or drivers of audit quality, so to try to determine what are the most important drivers of audit quality or of high quality audits. Also, the IAASB has issued a framework on this topic. Very interesting work, also something that IFIAR is really following what's happening, and we will also start a project on this. But let me say there is no consistent, or up to now, no consistent definition. And actually it seems that it's more easy to find when audit quality is lacking. And for today's discussion, I will use a narrow a narrow and outcome-oriented definition. High-quality audits are those with sufficient and appropriate audit evidence to support the audit opinion issued by the independent auditor, or in other words, that these audits are up to standards. And the benchmark is formed by the generally accepted auditing and ethical standards. This is also the benchmark for audit regulators when they do their inspections and when they report on the outcome of their inspections. So if jurisdictions adopted the ISAs and the Code of Ethics, that would then be the benchmark. So on the question, how far away are we from good audits? I'd like to answer this question from two perspectives. First perspective is the execution or in practice, so the implementation of the standards in practice. And the other perspective is more conceptually. I would like to say something about whether the standards are sufficient in terms of being a driver for consistent auditor behavior, and as such could drive consistent audit quality globally. But let me first start with the implementation in practice. IFIAR's members inspect audit firms to assess the quality of audits, and for 3 years on a row now, IFIAR has done an inspection findings survey amongst its members and has reported on the outcomes. The survey shows that the level of inspection findings in key areas of the audit is persistently too high. And we're talking about audits of listed companies and banks and insurance companies. On average, 47% of the inspected audits of the listed companies, banks and insurance companies, show deficiencies for which the audit firm did not obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence to support its opinion. Well, that's quite a high percentage. It's almost 50%, so to say, but I also like to say something that also should be borne in mind. It does not necessarily mean that the financial statements, the audited financial statements themselves, were materially misstated. When there are these deficiencies found, the audit regulators request the audit firms to do more work and to see whether the financial statements actually show a true and fair view. And that's very important to say. And another thing is, it should be noted that the survey results are providing a sort of backward look on audit quality, because these results relate to audits carried out in 2011 through 2013. So that means that all the investments by the firms, and they have made a lot of investments in quality so far, but all these investments around 2011 and through 2013 does not necessarily show through our survey. That will be shown in the coming surveys. The most common findings are in the area of fair value measurement, internal control testing, and revenue recognition. These are the most common findings if we look at the 3 years of surveys that we've done as IFIAR amongst our members. And overlooking the survey results more from a higher helicopter view, so to say, there are actually 3 things I think that are important. The main issue is a lack of consistency in the execution of high-quality audits. Half of the audits that are inspected, there were no significant issues or material issues found. The other half, they had material deficiencies. So there is this inconsistency in execution issue. The second thing is a lack of professional skepticism in the conduct of audits by the auditor and his team. That's also when we look at the most common findings and what is behind these findings, it often relates to professional skepticism. And Stephen Hadrill already touched upon that as well. And the last thing is that is shown by the survey is that the quality control systems that the firms have in place, despite the investments they made so far in it, are not yet sufficiently robust to detect these quality issues before the firms issue the audit opinions. And that's also, of course, a very important conclusion, so to say, from the survey. So coming back to the question, how far are we away from high-quality audits? Overall speaking, I would say we are still too far away from high-quality audits, given the 3 things I mentioned, but in particular the inconsistency in execution of high-quality audits. And as IFIAR, we analyze these survey outcomes also to be able to provide input to the standard setting boards, because when you look at the reasons behind these deficiencies, we could say, oh, it's all a matter of implementation by the firms. And that is, of course, it is a matter of how they implemented the standards in practice, how they complied with it. On the other hand, through our analysis, we also see areas when we look at the standards where we feel and think and believe that these could be strengthened by more clearer requirements, so that the standards in itself could also contribute more indirectly maybe, but also contribute to the improvement of audit quality. Because if the standards, they drive auditor behavior. The standards is what we all agree that, if you do that, then there is this good audit. So it's important that we also look closely at the standards. And as such, we are very happy as IFIAR also to see that the IAASB has defined projects for the coming years on areas in the audit where IFIAR members have found these persistently high levels of inspection findings, like on group audits, fair value measurements, but not only for financial institutions, but in our view it's a broader issue, professional skepticism and quality control. For the IESBA, we welcome the structure of the code project very much, in particular regarding the independence standards in there. Over the past years, there is a trend that independence regulation is more and more dealt with in national legislation. And as there are countries that use the Code of Ethics also for independence regulation, the code can still be relevant for cross-border group audit situations. And strengthening of the code where needed is therefore also a focus area for IFIA. So now the question more on a conceptual level, are the standards robust enough to continue to meet capital market needs and investor protection globally? I think more can be done, needs to be done when we look at the standards. And in that respect, let me raise a couple of important questions, I think, for the standard setting boards to consider going forward. The first one, do the IAASB and IESBA strategically aim at setting standards for investor protection globally, so meeting capital market needs? Or do they aim at setting standards that can be adopted easily also in developing countries? My second question, are the standard setters guiding and leading in setting the tone for what standards and innovations are needed for high-quality audits and for continued relevance of audits? Or are they following trends in regulatory reforms and innovations in technology that take place around the globe and then follow this trend? And the last question, since there is independent audit regulation and the international standards as adopted are being used in audit oversight also for remediation and enforcement purposes, are the standards and code clear and enforceable enough? Providing guidance without a clear enforceable requirement at the same time will not drive the consistency in auditor behavior sufficiently. And standard setting boards need to be aware of these trade-offs and their impact on audit quality globally. And the challenge will be how to keep pace with emerging developments and issues in order to have timely responses through the standards, through standard setting. And last question I'd like to address is what is IFIA doing then apart from providing input into the standard setting processes in order to improve audit quality globally? Well, IFIA will intensify its dialogues with the Big Six leadership of the global network firms the coming years and on various topics. The first thing is on deepening of the root cause analysis. What is behind the deficiencies that we as regulators come across? And then we ask them not to do the first layer of root cause analysis. That is what the firms have done already. Then the responses are often, what causes the deficiencies is that people or the team maybe does not have the right expertise, or there were time pressures, budget pressures, professional skepticism is an issue. But we want to talk with the firms that they go a little bit deeper, to really go to what drives behavior in the audit firms. So then we're talking about things like tone at the top, culture in the firms, business models, the structures, governance of audit firms. Those are important things also to look at, and what drives the behavior. Another thing is then that we expect the firms to come up with action plans that they should implement, that should then also be, of course, the right responses to the underlying root causes. And we will monitor the implementation, and we also expect the firms to measure the effectiveness of their measures so that they do that on a timely basis, so that they can also take other actions or measures when it turns out that one of the measures that they designed and thought would be the answer is not effective. So that is what we are doing the coming years with the firms. We will, of course, also monitor the recent developments, not only in the audit sector itself, but also in the regulatory reform area, because there is very interesting times actually the coming years, I would say, because if you look at the most recent regulatory reforms that are taken place in many parts of the world, they could, in my view, really have an impact on the audit market dynamics. I think that they could play an important role in putting more focus on quality, also when you look at the competition in the audit market. And I'm thinking about things like strengthening of auditor independence by firm rotation, further prohibitions of non-audit services, but also very importantly, the more informative auditor opinion, audit report. That could really drive further a competition model in the audit market, more on quality than on other aspects. And I should not forget the reforms that we also see in parts of the world with respect to strengthening the role of audit committees. Very important, but should also go together with more transparency on quality of audit firms and particular audits. So, and I'm happy that I can see also there a beginning trend that there is more transparency on the outcome of inspections by audit regulators, and that it's published, also naming the individual audit firms, but also I think in addition to that, what is also a good development is that there even in some jurisdictions that there will be transparency on the outcome of an inspection of a particular audit, and that outcome is being shared with the concerned audit committee. I think that is really a good development going forward. When we look at the audit sector itself, there are also very interesting developments. The big data and data analytics was already referred to, but also the challenges that this will have on talent within the firms, and also the mandatory firm rotation has an impact on talent in the firms. Last but not least, if you look at the growing consultancy practices within the firms and revenues even outgrowing the revenues of the audit service line, that is also something that we need to debate with the sector, of course. So all these recent developments, I mentioned them because these are on the agenda of IFER, and we will monitor them closely and discuss them. And of course, because these could all have an impact either positively or negatively on audit quality going forward. So I think I've covered with this the questions that Fayez was raising. I'd like to emphasize now at the end of my responses to the questions a few things, because there are also a lot of positive things in the recent developments, as I just said, that could have a positive impact on audit quality. Well, first of all, the firms are of course constantly looking at where to improve their systems, and they're doing the root cause analysis, and they are thinking of actions and implementing those, so that is very good. The standard setting boards, very good that they also are looking at where can we improve the standards going forward. So that should also have a positive impact. The role that the regulators can play nationally and on a IFER level, and also in their communications with the investor community and audit committee, so that they also look at their own roles. That's also very important going forward. So hopefully 10 years from now, when we would have the 20th anniversary of the PIOB, and if we would all look back, I hope that we can say that we were in 2015 at a sort of turning point in time, and that there was indeed from that time on a visible, observable, positive trend in audit quality. And there are first signs within IFER survey, that's my last word. A quarter of our members who responded to the survey observed an overall improvement of audit quality in their jurisdiction. So it's not a mission impossible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janine. I try and keep abreast of press releases and reports and things as much as I can, but that's probably the most succinct and clear assessment of IFIAR's role and views that I've heard, so thank you for that. I just had a couple of questions, follow-up questions. One, I think you answered. You'd mentioned that you have a good dialogue with the firms, you know, as to what you believe or what you jointly agree would help improve the audit findings. And I presume the same goes for the IAASB and IASBA, that you have a dialogue and communicate the areas where you think standards need to be developed or strengthened, and that's on a good path.
Yes, we have very regular dialogues, both with the firms and with the standard setting boards and the PIOB on, you know, on what we think or what we see through our work, our members' inspections, and we feed that back to them so that they can do, and you know, can respond to that and take that with them in their own roles. And with the firms, we have very intense sessions, like 3 times a year. Actually, next week we're going to meet in Tokyo with the Big Six leadership of the 6 global network firms. So, and those are very intensive sessions, so to say, and they provide lots of information. We ask them lots of information, and it's not only that we take that information for granted, but the coming 2 years we are also really, through our inspection programs nationally, we will also sort of challenge the information that we receive from the firms in terms of the root cause analysis, the action plans, and where they stand with the implementation, so that we get, you know, most out of our work through IFIA on an international level and what we are doing nationally.
The other question I had was, does IFIAR have principles of audit oversight that its member bodies are required to follow to ensure a consistency of approach in conducting the oversight function in different jurisdictions?
We have core principles of audit oversight. We've developed those, I think, already quite some years ago. We don't have them as a certain kind of membership criteria for IFIA, but our members are, of course, also looking at these core principles as a certain benchmark, and its use. And what we've done in March or April this year, we published a report on that. We took a few of these principles we had designed. The first principle is on how to do risk-based inspections, you know, the whole risk-based approach in audit oversight. And the second principle around reporting of inspection findings. We have done a survey amongst our members, how they implemented these principles or how they work with those principles. And we have issued a report on that. And so that is what we do also to that our members can learn from each other, share good practices around the globe, so to say. And we do more in terms of learning and cooperating. We have concluded a multilateral memorandum of understanding. So for our members who wants to become a signatory to this MMOU, and those who have become a signatory can then more easily exchange confidential information. And that is, of course, very valuable to strengthen audit oversight on a national level by our members. And we have our inspection workshops, and our enforcement workshop is also a new thing. We do a lot in terms of sharing information amongst each other. And also because in the end, through that, I also think that it will drive also consistency in approaches by the various audit regulators.
I'm sorry, and I don't want this to be a discussion between you and me, but one final question from me, which you'd mentioned the audit reforms and the fact that it's really too early to sort of get hard evidence on its impact, but you did point to some potential benefit in terms of competition, and but certainly what we observe is that there is, you know, I mean, if you start from the financial crisis and the FSB and a general agreement that in a complex global world you need more integration of regulatory regimes, etc. But on the audit side, a number of what we see is fragmentation and divergence rather than convergence. So you can take a principle like mandatory firm rotation and, you know, argue it on its pros and cons. And, you know, the IFAC position is there isn't enough empirical evidence to form a view. But that notwithstanding, it's there. But it's also being implemented in different ways, which become very difficult for a global audit firm to actually then comply with the various jurisdictional requirements. You know, they might have to rotate out of one jurisdiction and you get new auditors while the rest of the world, you know, you're still with. Is it on your work program to actually assess the risks of some of these audit reforms, as well as whether the benefits are being availed of?
Well, it's not only indeed the benefits, but it could also be certain, sort of negative impact on audit quality that could unintended also take place. So it's not that we only would monitor how can it contribute, but well, if it's positive or negative, we would of course want to know that, and we will follow that. And it's indeed, like IFIA, we cannot set any standards globally or whatsoever. And in particular around auditor independence, you see that, a lot of, the standards are really taken over, standard setting by the legislators nationally. That's maybe also because maybe on a global level there was not quickly enough given the crisis that took place, a credible enough, robust enough standard available. That's at least, speaking also from a Dutch perspective, it was around that time that in the Netherlands, the Ministry of Finance decided no longer to use the Code of Ethics for the independence standards, but to come up with their own standards. And what I heard is that that happened in other jurisdictions as well. So that is also maybe, that's why I also pose these three more strategical, conceptual questions. What are we aiming at from a standard setting point for the profession on an international level? It would be great if we would have international standards, also on independence, that investors would know this is, you know, if there's an audit opinion, this is what the auditor has done, and this is how his independence is ensured. Now it's really, it's so, it differs from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, where the group auditor is seated. Then, well, investors don't know exactly how these, what is actually what he can expect, I think, in terms of what kind of rules are there in that particular jurisdiction. So, yeah, hopefully at a certain point in time we will eventually have, it's my personal view, really international standards. It would make it a lot easier.
Good. Well, thank you very much, and that's a perfect introduction for me to bring Riyad into the discussion. Riyad, you're the only, I mean, we've had a number of international organization representatives speaking today, but you're the only sort of emerging economy panelist for today. And Janine raised a very interesting point in her presentation about, you know, standards for emerging economies versus standards for advanced economies. And that's the discussion that plays out in various guises in a number of standard setting fronts. You know, in the IFRS, should there be separate SME standards and listed company standards? And, you know, the purists will say there's only one set of standards, and, you know, then you get into all that kind of issue. But I guess a similar set of issues applies to the emerging economies on certainly the ICEs, and arguably, ethics is a very difficult conceptual area because then you're trying to change behaviors based on values, and no one society or regime can claim to have a lock on, what is the appropriate. So, given all of that, what do you see as the challenges for the developing or emerging economies to actually obtain audit quality, both given these kinds of issues, but also that the other elements in the chain that I'd referred to earlier are probably less mature in some emerging economies than in the advanced economies?
Sure. Thank you. Good afternoon, or may I say good evening, I think already. Congratulations again to the PIOB, and thank you for the invitation. I think I don't need to tell you how much we appreciate your work and we believe in what you do. So keep up the good work, as they say. When you talk about emerging economies, you ask about challenges. I can call them challenges or opportunity at the same time, because really in the emerging economy, not much of history we have when it comes to auditing or even accounting standard, which is in itself could be seen as a challenge, but obviously it's worked as an advantage for us. So we didn't have the long-lasting debates of should we apply this or that. We just grabbed them and we went ahead with them. So this is an obvious advantage obviously it's one thing adopting and signing that resolution, is another thing is implementation, obviously, of this. But I think the good news is when we sat with our colleagues in FERs and our other audit regulator, you're talking about, I think Stephen from the FRC mentioned today, consistency or inconsistency. So the way I look at it, actually, when we see the survey of FER and other individual members also as audit regulators, we see the same. So you can give the audit firms maybe credit here. They're actually consistent, not maybe in their deficiency at least. So the fair value issue came up with, I think, with most of, if not all of the audit regulator and the test of internal controls, for example. So they are actually consistent somehow. But our view has been always, when it comes to audit, there is bad audits and good audits, and this is how it's going to be. No matter what you do with your standard or regulations, bad drivers will always exist. Good drivers, they're always there. But I think it's what we do to reduce that number of bad drivers, if you would like. So I'm a firm believer of, yes, more inspection will definitely help in the corrective action and the detection. Prevention, setting standard, and I think it's been said enough today about this, since we are on the regulation and enforcement side. I would like to speak of inspection. And when I say inspection, inspecting and looking at accounting before auditing. A lot of talk about audit quality, but I think audit is as good as accounting and a fair presentation of that report. So this is what people are looking at. They're looking at not a good quality audit, they're hoping that they have in their hands good quality information and statement, even though I don't like the word financial statement because it's a performance statement. Especially when you apply this to the public sector, it gets very tricky. Because to me, in the private sector and public listed company, for example, accounting standard represent the performance without the word financial, because this is really what is matter in private sector or public listed company. It's always your bottom line, profit and loss. In the public sector, which is nothing maybe much been said today about it, and this is maybe another being me from the emerging economy plus being looking at public sector as well, and it makes even the discussion more complex about accounting before auditing. do I believe that we have a good accounting standard? I think we have reasonably good accounting standard and auditing standard that can always improve, and they can always, I would like to see less options in accounting standard. That will help, obviously, our enforcement and work that we do in the inspection. But back to the inspection. So the inspection, I think, is very important to focus not on audit firms, and this is where the different of model, and at least I can speak in Abu Dhabi, in our emerging economy, we don't look at audit firms. We look at audit files. We look at financial statements. So because, as you said, all the big four, why then we have this inconsistency? Because this is what audit is all about. It's not about what they have as systems or audit quality rules. It's the individual audits. So that is what's going to happen no matter how much we put, again. There will be always, definitely you will always have a different level of quality overall in every audit firms, like hospitals again. But always the doctor, the team who's going to operate in new matters, as they say. So I think this is where we come from. This is, I see it, an advantage, again, of emerging economy. This is the way we think. We try to think somehow we are not bound by any principles in the beginning. We don't, we didn't take accounting as is or auditing. So we had to challenge everything. And this is how we came with our models. Very little talk about, and that's why now I saw also the UK FRC, correct me if I'm wrong also, surprisingly they started to even inspect the Auditor General. So I was pleased to see this in one sense as like, our model was in the right direction since we didn't act like a traditional Auditor General. So we are actually the regulator of the external auditor. So we didn't, so I was pleased that we didn't wait for the day that is someone in the executive government coming and audit, someone is reporting to the Parliament or equivalent, which is always a challenge. So this is where I think a lot of, and I can give you a lot of examples. Beside external audit, we regulate internal audit, which also you don't hear much in the global arena as well, talking about internal audit, because people talked about business today and other regulation and standard. And who looked at this? I would guess it's very difficult to ask the external audit to look at all this. But internal auditor, definitely, if they are regulated. Soon, I think we are now even taking this to the next level where we're going to start to register even internal auditor and make sure also we have certain enforcement on internal auditor as well. So I think and the emerging economies, this is the real advantage that we have. We can always, we don't need to get into long debates to adopt practices. I'm not going to say standards since we are applying the standard, but the standard will always give you the minimum. No matter how you write them, principle-based, rules-based, they will always be the minimum. What is the audit, when they don't follow the standard, they follow their audit methodology, which is obviously based on the standard. But if you see what I mean, this is what is matter, the practice on the ground. So inspections are very important to focus. People having difficulties when they hear ourselves as regulator telling them, by the way, this audit file is failed, but yet I cannot tell you the numbers are wrong. The numbers still correct. So I think also expectation of the public, we need to address the expectation of the public as well by giving them reasonably what they are expected from us. It's not what make us legally look better, legally protected or anything like this. So they don't understand when we tell them the audit inspection failed and the auditor didn't do their job, but still this might not, even though this is theoretically logical, but I think we have to go beyond this and start to ensure that that the application of these standards are as they intended, as they say. So I know it's the end of the day. I can talk a lot about this area, but I would highlight again in conclusion, that is, I was very pleased to see the attendance today coming from different, and this is what we need really. We need to talk more, we need to listen to each other, looking at our concern. And as you see in the emerging economies, we have more or less the same issues you're talking about, and I think Janine would agree that is from the FER surveys and other, you can see we have the same challenges in a way. But maybe if there is any advantage is that we can always move quickly, try things, we see it doesn't work, we go back to another practice, which is help, especially when you're talking about practice. We're not talking about changing principles every day or main things, but practices, procedures, things on the ground needs to be really adapting fast to changes. Rotation, this is an old discussion for us. We already established this 5 years ago or more in the statutory auditor appointment roles also. Also getting in the details sometimes it matters. For example, how many of us comparing the proposal of the audit firms with the actual work in terms of hours, for example. This is just something we added to our inspection and highlighted to, and it was amazing to see the result of this. You see the proposal saying certain hours about the partners, and then you see the actual work is different. So how much, so all these things matters really in the end of the day, and that's why I think as audit regulators, definitely we can improve the quality of our audit, and also we can be hopefully a good, give you a good feedback as standard setters also to take into consideration. And just for the sake of time, just want to thank you and conclude. Thanks so very much.
Thanks very much, Riyadh. I think we still have time for questions, right? Aileen and then Toshi. In the front row here.
Thank you very much. Aileen Pearce, from a member of the PIOB. Janine, I was kind of leaping out of my seat wanting to ask you a question, so I guess I'll address this directly to you. I was struck that when you spoke about the deficiencies in the audit, you, as I understood it, you attributed them to either limitations in the implementation of ISIS and ethics standards, or limitations in those standards themselves, things that we're not regulated for. And I suppose my question really is, does IFER ever consider the possibility that some of those deficiencies are as a result of deficiencies in the education and training of the auditors? Because I guess that's where I'm coming from, that it's not all about regulations in auditing and ethics standards. It's, to me, the fundamental link in all of that is education and training. And I guess I learned a lot from what you said, but I was very struck by the fact that there wasn't one reference to education or training, and I just wonder what your view on that is.
Yes. Thank you for that question. Yes, education and training is, of course, indeed also very important, and it is being discussed also with the firms, because actually one of the most common responses by the firms to the first time that they did a root cause analysis on the deficiencies, like 2 years ago, was, okay, we're going to give more training to the people, we do more tooling, more guidance. So it is often being debated, but we are actually now in a phase that we say, yes, training, that's fine and that's okay, but somehow it still doesn't solve the whole issue. But training is, of course, very important, and not only taking the education before people become a certified accountant, but also, in particular, I think, when they're practitioners and doing audits on a daily basis, in particular also specific industry things like auditing a financial institution is something totally different than retail, retail or whatsoever. So there is a need for a constant, permanent training, and in how far this is, it is not only because, like we as regulators, let me put it that way, we are not doing the root cause analysis ourselves, like going into the firms and start doing that ourselves. It's very difficult. We have not the capacity to do that in terms of people, resources. It's also the firms should do that. They have a business problem, so to say. They need to look into it, dive into it. And training is one of the things, but it's not the underlying root cause, as we call it, because you also often see that they have done already a lot in terms of training, but somehow it's not successful, effective enough. Does that respond a little bit to your question? Yeah, okay, all the things, yeah.
In many ways, it is a turn at the top issue because, I mean, these, certainly the large network firms have very sophisticated training programs, but I think what Janine is saying, they have them, people go through them, but they're not, or
show.
even within this firm, some people are acting according to the training they received and others are not. And the root cause analysis is what creates that. And I guess it has to be, speculating, that whoever the manager in charge is enforcing a different set of expectations or rigor. But Toshi.
Toshi Kitamura. I'll be a little more specific. In terms of audit quality, perhaps the most recent and great achievement is an auditor's report, including key audit matters. And in this sense, it seems to me that Britain has gone ahead of the other countries, and we have already achieved some experiences. So, from your viewpoint, will you please give your personal view about the direction of deepening of the application of this audit reporting division and KAM treatment? And in Japan and perhaps in many East Asian countries, the impact of the audit report and CAM haven't been deeply affected. That's a problem, and sooner or later they may realize. But in terms of the implementation of audit report or CAM considerations, I wonder the spillover effects of the British experiences to the other countries, including European countries and Middle Eastern countries. How do you see the spillover effect of British experiences in these two areas, audit report and CAM?
So I think maybe this is a question to Janine, is, given that auditor reporting is considered to be one of the most fundamental step functions up in terms of audit standards, given that there is not, implementation is still in its early days, how does one use the success stories of implementation to try and propagate the implementation in countries that haven't fully... Yeah, well, maybe Robert can have the first crack at that.
Oh, sorry. I'll probably echo, but in a different way, some things that Stephen said. I think it's useful to see this not just as a question of a standard and its implementation, because the environment and the institutional framework in which a change is introduced has a huge impact on how it takes effect. So I think that the context in which that change took place in the UK was one in which it wasn't seen as a sort of minimum compliance issue and what do you have to do to satisfy the new standard in the eyes of a regulator. It was that you had an expectation from an investor community that they had asked for this change and they were expecting to see results. And it was also done in the context of a huge amount of competitiveness in the audit market where it simply wouldn't have looked right to say, one of the key points on which we'll seek to win this audit is that we'll apply this standard in the, potentially the least embarrassing way, because you've got audit committees under pressure to show that they really are focused on audit quality. So I think understanding the context of institutions and incentives which help standard implementation is important, and I suppose that's why I would also think that for an inspection regime and a regulatory regime, it's interesting to look at things which are internal to the firms, but actually some of these explanations of different performance might lie in the environment in which people operate, and that there's as much that you can do to comment on whether the environment is favourable for enthusiastic implementation of the spirit of what's required to help with that. Just taking a really simple example here, there are some audit committee chairs who would be horrified to find that there was any failure to comply with the standard. There are others who would treat it as a fairly marginal consideration, and people in the tendering process in the UK have spotted differences, and actually they will respond to that, because if somebody says, well, that's an interesting part of evaluation of whether you should be our auditors, and other people say, no, this is the first thing we're talking about, why can't you make this work? This has a huge impact. So there are plenty of other institutional forces around other than the pure inspection regime. Audit takes place in a context of governance and so on.
Sorry, I'm getting flagged for 5 minutes left, but I think, Jane, did you have your hand up? Okay, could we have the microphone down here?
Faiz, this is really a question about implementation, because I think looking back at the capital markets standards implementation, it really gained traction when the FSAP program came through and put an external independent series of bodies to actually come into jurisdictions and examine whether they were saying that they were implementing what they were saying they were implementing. And I remember IOSCO giving a positive acclamation to ISAs, but we don't seem, and I know that there was some discussion of the ROSC having some implementation effect, but we don't seem to have a global framework for actually seeing whether jurisdictions are implementing ISAs. Now, there's a lot of work I know goes through CAP and through the profession, but at a national level or jurisdictional level, we don't yet seem to have any framework. Maybe Janine might like to comment on that, because I guess that one of the issues that niggle at my mind is to hear Robert talk about enthusiastic or unenthusiastic implementation. It's sort of worrying, because hopefully we would want jurisdictions that have put their hand up to say that they're actually implementing ISAs to be able to prove in some way to somebody that that's actually the case. And I just thought, looking 10 years down the track, Janine gave a very, I thought, rosy and lovely view of what we might hope to have at our next PIOB birthday. But one of the things that I probably would have in my wish list would be some sort of framework that absolutely made it very clear that if a jurisdiction said it was adopting ISAs, it was.
Yeah, could I just have a crack at answering that? I think this gets back to the advanced economy, emerging economy, or maybe put it better, the the listed companies subject to oversight and the private companies not subject to oversight. Adoption, I think Riyadh mentioned, adoption is easy, sign it into legislation or whatever. Implementation, adoption is binary, yes or no. Implementation is a quality assessment. And certainly for the listed companies and for those, country jurisdictions that have audit oversight regimes and they're part of IFIA, there is some sort of structure to sort of assess the quality of implementation. For private companies, it's very difficult. I mean, Jules will recall the early days of the ROSCs, where on that question, it was basically talking to people. How good is it? Because it's almost impossible to go in, and you're talking early 2000s, I guess, to go in and say what is the quality of implementation, short of doing what the audit oversight regimes that are under IFIA are. So, that's really a very, very difficult one. But I think at least in terms of economically significant entities, if you equate that with listed companies, at least I think there is process. I know there's a question at the back. Is it very quick? Because it's definitely the last question.
Thank you so much. My name is Naveed. I'm from Dubai. I'm fascinated by the collective wisdom and experiences in this room, probably around over thousands of years of experience. Very quick
that's
question.
Just me.
Very quick question to Janine, but not as IFIA chair, but as the Dutch regulator. You issue public reports on name basis. Does this affect the audit quality? Because now you are naming and shaming the audit firms on the inspection findings.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's maybe too early to tell because we've indeed done that for the first time last year in September. And so we are now a year later. We are actually now starting up a new cycle of inspections again at the same firms. So next year we can report on the outcome, and then hopefully we will see some improvement. But it's then not, it's always, then the big question, what was the real driver behind any improvement? It's not, it will not be only the fact that we published the findings on a name-by-name basis, I would think. I also would hope that it would be more a sustainable kind of improvement, that it comes from the changes within the firms and that they, know how to better and do more consistent quality audits. So, yeah, that's what I hope. But the fact that we publish the findings so in detail, actually, and mentioning the names of the firms, has more to do with the transparency aspect, that we believe that it's important that also like audit committees can read something about audit quality also when with the firm rotation that is taking place. There will be more changes of auditors. There is also that audit committees need to evaluate the quality of their auditors. They have to engage with them. For them to do their job well, they need information, and that's why we do this.
Okay, well, it's been such a rich discussion that I won't attempt to try and sum up, but just some highlights. I mean, I think probably the main point I was trying to make is that the objective is high-quality investor information, that there are various actors in that chain. The chain is only as strong as its weakest link. I think the audit profession has an active and vigorous dialogue going on as to how it can improve its link in that chain. But my personal observation is there needs to be a more global and horizontal discussion of how all the bits in the chain fit together to ensure that objective. I think from Robert, we heard that he's got a new roof, and we congratulate him for that. But, I think what I took away from Robert's remarks was he still feels that the audit is needed, but that maybe we're not maximizing the opportunities that auditors have for providing assurance beyond the narrow scope of the financial statement report, and given the complexity of today's world and the effects that one single mistake, error, malfeasance can have, can be so significant and so widespread that perhaps that's something that the audit firms should project more forcefully as being in the public interest, that they provide that kind of assurance. From Janine, we heard about the work that IFIAR is doing with the firms, with the standard setting boards, internally to try and ensure that the principles of good oversight are projected, and also just looking at the effects of reforms and how they're going. And I think that's a very impressive suite of actions which hopefully will over time improve the audit function. And from Riyadh, we heard that it's actually should be taken as an opportunity to leapfrog generations of learning and missteps to be able to take off-the-shelf global standards developed independently of high quality. That's encouraging to hear. I think we also heard that that the audit quality is not just a question of assessing performance as an absolute, but it's also perhaps an advantage of building capacity, that there is probably more of a learning benefit that comes from oversight in the developing world. And also just, and I think this is a message to us all, that when we have these kinds of dialogues, that even countries that may not be at the front end of implementation or economic consequences of non-compliance have a lot to learn and a lot to share. So with that, let me conclude. I'm going to be a little bit naughty here, Eddie, and divulge coffee break and lunch conversations to say how much the people I've talked to, and certainly me personally, have enjoyed this. We all go to a lot of conferences. I have an attention span problem, but I've actually been fully engaged all day, or as engaged as I can be. I've learned a lot, and it's just encouraging to know that there's so much good stuff going on in this important space. So on behalf of my panelists, thank you very much for the opportunity.
So we've come to the end of the day. We have 5 minutes to go. We won't use the 5 minutes. We're all tired. But let me say one thing. Look at the title that you've been enduring the whole day through, the title of the seminar: Future Challenges in Audit Oversight. Future Challenges in Audit Oversight. We've had two analogies thrown at us today. One from Robert about a roof that leaked. Another one from Nick about a car. So I was thinking, is there something witty I can say about these two analogies? Is there something in common? Perhaps a roof stands on 4 pillars, and most cars run on 4 wheels. And we had today the privilege of listening to 4 panels here. So I thought, is there a moving roof standing on 4 wheels that can help the PIOB in its opening discussions on the strategy? The board has just started discussing the PIOB strategy for the next 5 years. They're all here present today. We will be discussing these issues in the next 2 days, and I'm sure that the wealth of ideas that all of you have been so generous to share with us will indeed feed a lot of the discussions. But I was able to come up with 4 wheels. One is that, 4 challenges. One is that for us at the PIOB, it is going to get harder. Increased complexity. It is obvious from the 4 panels, but clearly from the first panel, that this is going to get harder, that the issues are more difficult, that the standard setting boards are issuing more complex standards, that getting public interest input is getting more complex because stakeholders are more. So my first wheel is, this is going to get harder for us. The second wheel is that not only we're going to be facing increased complexity, we're going to be facing an increased qualitative demand on oversight to actually help change behavior. And many of the panelists have raised this issue of changing culture, changing behavior. The point about the heroic auditor raised by Jane, the issues about looking forward, put forward by Stephen Hadrill, good drivers and bad drivers. How can we from the PIOB help with a more stringent, I suppose, oversight, helping that process of changing behavior? That's my wheel number 2. Wheel number 3 makes it even harder, because it's about the increased scope of oversight. Panels 2 and 3 dealing with issues of global response and financial stability have shown, and Jules has made this point very effectively, is it enough to do this narrow standard setting oversight, or are there issues beyond standard setting affecting the accounting profession that have a bearing on financial stability? Should the PIOB have a look at these elements? So this is getting very tough because it's harder, bigger scope, and more demanding. The last one, coming from the last panel, the last wheel driving the roof, is perhaps how can the PIOB, in this very challenging objective of implementation and application of standards, what can the PIOB do? And I think Eileen's targeting in on education was very, very telling. So I can only thank you all very much for coming over, the generosity of your comments. On behalf of the board who's standing before me, thank you very much. We have arranged for a reception, a modest way to say thank you. You will be having a glass of Spanish Catalonian champagne in our beautiful gardens at the PIOB. It's about a 2-minute walk from here. I think you've got it in your map. Should any one of you wish, the reception will be at 7:30, but if any one of you, for whatever logistical reason, wishes to come along to the PIOB, you will be very welcome there. So let me close this seminar, thanking you again. Thank you very much.